the near-death experiences are more like surrealism than impressionism, in that the near-death experiences are lucid and clear. The other interesting fact about them is they tend to be cohesive or coherent. They present narratives that fit together and make sense, whereas dreams kind of bounce around. So another interesting problem for a purely physical view is to explain the cohesiveness of these experiences and why they should be that way when other hallucinatory or indisputably hallucinatory experiences are not.
This episode of Levity is brought to you by Vitalism Foundation.
Vitalism Foundation is a non-profit with a revolutionary mission to achieve unlimited lifespans in peak health.
It's a community of action driven by vitalism, a new moral philosophy whose first tenet is that life and health are good, death is humanity's core problem, and aging its primary agent. They're one of the few groups that truly understand aging as the emergency that it is.
Vitalism's goal is nothing short of monumental: to allocate 1% of global GDP to this project. It's ambitious, but it's exactly what's needed to tackle aging head-on.
As a member of Vitalism, you'll get access to a private community, exclusive content, and invites to special conferences. Plus, you'll receive insider prices on longevity wellness services from Vitalism's mission-aligned partners.
But more than that, you will be supporting a mission that's too important to leave to others to tackle.
So, you should really join us. Follow the link in the description below. For a limited time, you get 30% off forever. Just use the promo code LEVITY at checkout.
Again, that's 30% off forever with the promo code LEVITY. Let's make a difference together. In this podcast, we are not only interested in the science of prolonging our lives, but we are very interested in whether this is a good idea. So a few weeks ago, we spoke with John K. Davis, and we talked about overpopulation arguments and other worries people have. Today, we have the honor of having another California resident, distinguished Professor John Martin Fischer at University of California Riverside, as our guest. Professor Fischer has worked on the metaphysics of death and philosophy of religion and led a multi-year, multi-pronged research project on immortality, funded in 2012 by the John Templeton Foundation. He is the author of several books, including Death, Immortality, and Meaning in Life, published by Oxford University Press, and Near-Death Experiences, Understanding Visions of the Afterlife, co-authored with Benjamin Mitchell-Yellin, Oxford University Press also. And most recently, he has come up with a debate book together with Stephen Cave, Should You Choose to Live Forever, out on Routledge. Professor Fischer, welcome to Levity, the Longevity Podcast.
Thank you very much.
Great. So you are in California right now, so we should say good morning, although it's evening here in Sweden.
Good evening to you.
Good morning to you, Professor. So, Professor, how did you get into philosophy, and how did you get into the philosophy of death?
For as long as I can remember, I was interested in death because my father was a physician. He was a cardiologist, and that was back in the days when doctors would be on call all night, and sometimes people would have heart attacks, and he would leave in the middle of the night, and he'd come back the next day, and obviously sometimes his patients didn't make it, and I was thinking about it and trying to figure out what's going on here. Also, I'm from a Jewish family, and my relatives were, many of them, killed in the Holocaust. There were many stories and a lot of sadness in my family as I was growing up. So the whole subject of death appeared on my radar early on. How did I get involved with philosophy? Again, I think I've always thought philosophically, but I started college at Stanford University as a history major. Then I changed to economics, and I discovered I wasn't good enough with the mathematics. But I took then an introductory philosophy class, and I realized this is my thing. This is what I love. And so I suppose that's where it started more formally.
So you were also the coordinator of a project about immortality. Can you say something about that and what you learned from that?
Yes, it was funded by the John Templeton Foundation. It was $5.1 million. We distributed the money in a series of competitions, science, philosophy, and theology. Science got 2.5 million. The rest of us got less. And we had a broad scope. The scientists were studying near-death experiences. Also, social science would have been included. So they were studying cross-cultural phenomena and reactions to near-death experiences and conceptions of personal identity, views about longevity in the afterlife. The philosophers were discussing uh, conceptions of heaven and hell. They were discussing um, they were discussing personal identity and different ideas about immortality, whether immortality would be a good thing or not. The theologians obviously overlapped with the philosophers to some degree in discussing the afterlife. It was very successful. It was illuminating to me. It's the reason I got interested in near-death experiences, because I saw the proposals by the scientists and I read uh, the results, their research, and it really got me interested. So one of the books you mentioned was with Benjamin Mitchell-Yellin, who was my postdoc on the Immortality Project. I only started thinking about and reading about near-death experiences through the grant, and it was about 10 years ago. We do have a web page which we can direct you to with all the results, all the publications and podcasts and so forth. And I think there are hundreds. I think there are more than 200. And so that was very exciting.
In philosophy, and in particular, I guess, in what we would call analytic philosophy or philosophy that is inspired by science, I feel that, in my experience, near-death experiences is something that's somewhat looked upon as with suspicion or not taken very seriously. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. And as I said, I had never seen any treatments of them. There's a short skeptical discussion of near-death experiences in Shelley Kagan's book, Death. Um, I know of no other analytic treatments of near-death experiences. Um, I think it's generally thought, to be within the domain of New Age thinking or Christian thinking. Uh, I used to I used to believe that you would find the near-death experiences on the aisle right near the crystals in a New Age shop. But I was very surprised to learn that serious, rigorous scientists, especially there's some in Europe and Switzerland in particular, study the phenomena. And uh, a scientist who was in the UK and now is in New York in the US, who has had a longitudinal study on near-death experiences and trying to corroborate or at least test the hypothesis of the out-of-body experience part of a near-death experience. So I discovered that they are less disreputable than I had thought and that most philosophers thought. And I'm hoping to, through my work, I think I've got at least some analytic philosophers more interested.
Well, you definitely made me more interested. So I have friends who are very intelligent and well informed who are very interested in near death experiences as an empirical way of believing in an afterlife. And that's, of course, where the philosophy comes in, that if this is held on faith, that, well, there's a heaven, that's my belief. Well, we can't say very much more than that. But this here is interesting because they say we respect ordinary methods of reaching truth, and we respect empiricism, and we also think we have evidence. We have evidence that can hold up, so to speak. We have a kind of a rational belief that there is something waiting for us when we die.
Right. That's why there's so much interest in near-death experiences. Um, I believe, though, that they do not provide strong evidence of an afterlife or a non-physicalist view about the mind. I believe that there's a lot of motivated reasoning or confirmation bias that plays a role in people's evaluation of that empirical evidence. By that, I mean basically the tendency to find confirming evidence and to disregard disconfirming evidence because one wants a certain hypothesis to be true. And I find that throughout the literature and popular discussions, and even some of the scholarly discussions of near-death experiences and how to interpret them. My view is that they are real in the same way that dreams and hallucinations are real, although I don't think they're just like dreams or hallucinations, but they are real. People have them. And what's really fascinating about them is they exhibit similar patterns over time and cross-culturally, similar patterns. There's usually an out-of-body experience, and then an experience as of being out of one's body. So we call it an OBE, or an out-of-body experience. And then also what's sometimes called the transcendent or transcendental part of a near-death experience, where in some way your soul or mind separates from your body and you're guided toward another realm, typically by a deceased loved one or a respected authority figure, often a religious authority. You're guided toward either a light or a gated realm. I sometimes joke that heaven is a gated community on this conception. And sometimes you go through the barrier, as in the famous Eben Alexander near-death experience, the neuroscientist who's written it up. Proof of Heaven is the name of his book. But often you get right to the river or the fence or the gate, and then you wake up. So there are patterns, and there are more specific details that are shared. And so that's really very, very interesting. But my overall view, we can go through details if you want, but my overall view is that they can be explained naturalistically, not necessarily supernaturalistically.
So you mentioned Eben Alexander, and you begin your book on the afterlife experiences with a quotation there where he talks about flying among butterfly with a beautiful girl, and he's saying it's all so incredibly real. It's more real than what we normally think is real. It's like hyper real. And of course, he wrote this book that was read by millions. It was such a profound experience for him. And then you say, well, this kind of experience is something that's been shared across time, across culture, and then you get the kind of prima facie, almost empirical confirmation that there is something after this life, right? But you say not so fast. So what are the, let's say, the kind of most difficult cases for the philosopher, or to explain away, so to speak, to explain as something completely physical and not something that is reflecting a reality beyond this reality?
I think the most difficult phenomena in this realm are the apparently non-physical, veridical, or true reports of people after they've awakened from unconsciousness. And they report a near-death experience, and they report some empirical fact that comes from or was part of the content of their near-death experience, and it turns out to be true. And there are quite a number of instances of these phenomena. And that's at least prima facie strong evidence of at least there being something that's going on in near-death experiences that we need to take seriously. And of course, these phenomena, the contents of these experiences are empirical. They're not then in themselves strong evidence of an afterlife. If people have afterlife contents, those unfortunately are not corroborated. But at least it suggests that if people have those kinds of veridical or true experiences, that might be something you could extend or extrapolate to the non-physical. So I'd say that's one of the most challenging. The other thing is they are different from dreams and most hallucinations. We do, however, have lucid dreams sometimes, but in general, dreams are not super clear in the colors, and they are more like surrealist paintings than impressionistic paintings. And the near-death experiences are more like surrealism than impressionism, in that the near-death experiences are lucid and clear. The other interesting fact about them is they tend to be cohesive or coherent. They present narratives that fit together and make sense, whereas dreams kind of bounce around. So another interesting problem for a purely physical view is to explain the cohesiveness of these experiences and why they should be that way when other hallucinatory or indisputably hallucinatory experiences are not.
Eben Alexander is making exactly that point, that I'm not talking about a dream. I'm talking
Right,
about something that I can determine is veridical because of its nature. It's
right,
I got almost the feeling of reading Descartes' meditations of clear and distinct ideas
right,
when he says, I have a clear and distinct idea, so I can't be fooled, right? This must
right,
be
right.
correct, right?
Well, the first thing to note is that people have lucid dreams. They have dreams that present themselves as ultra real, to use uh, Eben Alexander's phrase. Um, and they are not perceptions of an external reality, they're dreams. I believe people have hallucinations that are so real that they act in accordance with them or based on them. So, what I would say is the mere quality of the mental experience or the representation in someone's mind does not imply anything about the external world. Um, yes, when we go about our lives and we have perception and it's clear and we're pretty sure that there's not a mirage or some sort of distortion in our perceptual apparatus, we take that as strong evidence that we're seeing something external, veridically, truly, or accurately. But there are contexts, special contexts, in which we can have lucid experiences, and upon reflection, we can conclude that they are suspect. And For instance, if when we wake up we realize we were dreaming, that gives us some reason to be dubious about the external reality of what we're perceiving. Also, there are certain disorders, mental slash visual disorders, in which people have extremely lucid experiences that turn out to be hallucinatory. I would also mention the phenomenon again of motivated reasoning or confirmation bias. Eben Alexander grew up in a Christian family, but he reports in his book that it never really took with him. He remained agnostic or not a practicing Christian. But he also mentions that he always wished he were convinced of the truth of the religious beliefs. So that kind of suggests if he came into this experience with that mindset, that upon reconstruction after he regained consciousness, that desire might have played some role. So I agree with you. The evidence, the manifest sincerity, the cross-cultural and cross-temporal similarities, they do establish a prima facie case. But as with other prima facie cases, we can be wrong. Seems, if you ask me, does it seem to you that the world is flat? Yes, it does seem to me that the world is flat. But I'd say the history of science and the history of intellectual development and inquiry often involves dislodging very intuitive views that seem absolutely clear to us. This may be one of those cases.
You write about some cases, though, where it's very hard to see what would be the natural explanation, and that is the cases with blind people having these kind of experiences.
Yes.
So,
Well,
so doesn't that mean that there is some other way of experiencing than a physical way of experiencing?
well, the first thing I'd say is there is a syndrome, and Charles Bonnet, I believe it's called, which I write about. I may have gotten the name wrong, but it's well documented situation where people are blind and they report visual hallucinations. And so there is that. Secondly, I would distinguish with regard to perception, and this is not going to be scientifically very sophisticated, but you can distinguish the operation of the eyes and the way in which signals from the outside world get translated in the visual or perceptual apparatus that we have, our eyes and the nerves that connect the eyes with the brain, on the one hand, and the way the brain is capable of processing that information. And I think that, so some people are born with sight, and something happens to them, either through an accident or trauma or disease, that destroys the eyes, or what might be called the perceptual apparatus, the ability to take signals from the external world and send it to the brain. But those people still have the capacity in their brains to generate what is phenomenologically or experientially visual experiences. And those are the blind people who I believe have visual hallucinations and visual, not a near-death experiences. I don't think there's any corroborated or confirmed example of someone blind from birth who has those experiences.
Interesting. I mean, that would be the case, right? When you have somebody who has damaged their brain, the whole area that is responsible for vision, so to speak, and they still say, well, I've never seen anything in my life, but now when I was about to die, I
Yeah,
saw the gates of heaven. Right?
right.
That would be very hard for the physicalist or
Yes.
to
Well,
explain.
that would be
And
difficult.
you never seen that. You say we never seen that.
That's interesting. I don't think we have seen indisputably cases apart from right at death. Um, I don't think we've seen other cases where a blind person who was blind from birth reported visual experiences. Now, on their deathbed, I don't know. I don't know enough about what they report on their deathbed. And I agree, if they've never had the capacity from vision from birth and never had visual experiences throughout their life and had very clear visual experiences right as they're dying, that would be interesting, important evidence. I, I, I believe this is an empirical question. This is an empirical question about the blind. And so we can't, from our philosophical armchairs, a priori, before experience, say there can't be such. That way, I think the thesis would be empty. So I'm open to that. That would be difficult.
Can I ask, are these experiences purely visual, or are there other senses involved as well? Is it auditory? Do they sense or smell things?
Good. Thank you, Peter. First, there is a range of hallucinations that are reported. And in general, apart from near-death experiences, people do have olfactory, auditory, I don't know if they have tactile, but maybe a range of hallucinatory experiences. Now, whether those are part of near-death experiences, I honestly don't know. There are limits to my empirical knowledge of the phenomena themselves. I wouldn't be surprised at all. I wouldn't be surprised. And in my view, it wouldn't really change the probative or evidentiary value of the reports. But that's a very interesting question. And we do have evidence of auditory hallucinations. Yeah. Maybe I should mention a book by Oliver Sacks, the famous neuroscientist or neurologist, called Hallucinations. And he goes through much of the empirical evidence. And I should point out that he has in that book a report of an LSD trip, a trip or a set of experiences induced by ingestion of a hallucinogenic substance, LSD. And he didn't have it himself, but it was a report from a young man, though he himself did experiment with hallucinogens, as he discusses. But the report is startlingly like a near-death experience report. Everything, the out-of-body experience, the going toward another domain, the life review, which is part of a near-death experience, everything very similar, and yet it's indisputably um, part of induced by something physical. Now, that doesn't imply that the contents do not point to something non-physical. Going back to famous title, I can't now remember the author. I will go back. Yes, going back to Aldous Huxley's book, the title of which was The Doors of Perception, it's always possible that a physical substance could open the doors to another realm. That's possible. But the reason I mentioned Oliver Sacks' book is mainly that he discusses hallucinations, and it's fascinating.
I was also thinking about Michael Pollan's book. I think it's called How to Change Your Mind. It's also that when you described these near-death experiences, that was what I was thinking about. That you could kind of, I mean, for me, I always reach for like scientific explanation for why this is occurring, and I think that for me it's like it seems to me that we only have a small part of our mind actually that is conscious to us, right? So there could be a lot of things going on in these very severe experiences in life, like when we're close to dying.
Recently, there's been an article in the New York Times reporting some new scientific evidence about the similarity between near-death experiences and experiences from psychedelic substances. Really interesting. Now, but the meaning, like with all empirical work, you have to figure out the meaning and interpretation. And right, there are basically two kinds of interpretations, naturalist and supernaturalist. And one, the naturalist would be these are purely physical phenomena. The contents are the result of traumatic injuries or events that change the functioning of the brain. And we know that in near-death contexts, the brain, functions in slightly different ways. There are different hormones, different levels of certain chemicals or hormones. But I think it's a combination of the physical changes and the person's cultural niche, what they've been subject to or experienced throughout their lives, personally and in their cultures. So that combination gives rise in certain circumstances to physical experiences. I think that it can be explained as an evolutionary fact that, I mean, it's well known that we have certain capacities to remain calm, for instance, and hyper rational, and keep calm and carry on. We have that ability and increased strength too in near-death context. And it might be that evolutionarily, because we have that capacity, it's necessarily accompanied with the tendency to have these peaceful, serene, positive near-death experiences, what might be called a spandrel, an evolutionary spandrel, something that accompanies something that is in itself an advantage. So those are the naturalistic considerations. The supernaturalistic considerations are, first, the evidence that Patrick pointed to, that the contents tend to be about contact with another realm, a non-physical realm. Also, it seems hard to physicalistically or naturalistically explain some of the true reports. But also, there's always the idea that only parts of our brains are actually accessible to us or function in a way that might give us access to a different realm. It's not just that we have access to a different perspective on our physical world, but it might be that the mind or the brain is capable of opening us up to a different reality. There's no way that I can show that the naturalistic view is preferable, really. I can't establish it. I am a default materialist or physicalist, so I come to these debates with that antecedent view. And maybe I engage in some confirmation bias there, but what I believe is because of the success of science in predicting and even explaining the world around us, I have a preference for a scientific explanation. But I do not believe science establishes that there's not a mind separate from the body or there's not an afterlife. Matter of fact, one of the people who got a subgrant from the Immortality Project, Yuval Avner, who's a philosopher at the Claremont College's Scripps College near us in California. For some reason, we Californians are especially interested in these phenomena. Yuval is writing a book based on his research and thinking, in which he argues that science is totally neutral with respect to dualism about the relationship between the brain and the mind. I had always thought, prior to reading his work, which is excellent, that science showed to a very high probability that that the brain is not separate from the mind, that the mind is the brain. But his arguments have convinced me otherwise. He does not argue that science shows that the mind is separate from the brain, but he does argue that science does not, even to some small degree, point to physicalism. And so that's my view. It's just, and again, this is a realm where I call them epistemological black holes. They are contexts, like religious contexts, where people claim that someone was cured of a disease by a faith healer, or that they've witnessed God. They've had direct contact with God through a mystical or spiritual religious experience. They're epistemic black holes because there's no way of establishing that or disconfirming it decisively. There's just no way. And that's why, one reason why religious beliefs and beliefs about faith healing and alternative therapies in general, they flourish. And I think near-death experiences is another place like that.
That's interesting, and it really confirms my experience too with people who are neuroscientists, that they are often quite agnostic, and sometimes they talk in what sounds to me as a philosopher a dualist language.
Right.
You know, they don't necessarily commit themselves to some kind of identity theory. No, Eben Alexander, isn't he a neuro specialist himself?
A neurosurgeon. He is
okay.
A neurosurgeon. He may even have an advanced degree in neuroscience. And that's actually one reason why his work was so influential, still is. Two reasons. One is he purported to be agnostic, so he didn't come to this with antecedent religious views. There's a whole literature, not just the New Age literature, but the Christian literature and religious literature in general, but specifically Christian literature, where people report connecting with Jesus or other Christian religious figures in an afterlife. But it turns out almost all of those were antecedently very religious people. But he antecedently was an agnostic and also a serious scientist. And therefore, it's assumed he would be skeptical, or at least would consider the evidence with a high standard, of scientific accuracy. So yes, it is. Now, I find it really interesting that you said that in your discussions with scientists, they don't really come to conclusions about dualism. I think that confirms, or at least is another way of arguing for the conclusion that Professor Avner comes to, that science is actually silent with respect to these questions about an afterlife and a dualistic conception of the mind. I think if you press them, some of them, if you ask them, what is the significance of your work with regard to these philosophical questions, they will answer, I don't know. I know many of them, as reported, for instance, in a Scientific American special issue on the brain, many of them are naturalists, but I'm not sure that their arguments are sound philosophically.
So, as a naturalist, we are saying that these near-death experiences, well, the mind can create these themselves without there actually being an afterlife outside the mind. But you also discuss cases where it's harder to make that argument, where you say, well, people who know things that they couldn't really know because they were not conscious There's no brain activity really. People who are dead on the operating table, and then they come back and they say, well, I could hear the doctors talking about these things, and I could, etc., etc. These kind of outer body experiences that are also very common, that people feel like they're looking down on themselves on the operating table. They come back. How can they do that if there is not something that's kind of lifting from the body and looking down without eyes? That is, that the perception is extra physical.
So, two separate questions. The one about apparent out-of-body experiences or experiential out-of-body experiences, whether they're actually accurate, that's another question. And then the other question was about apparently non-physical, veridical perception, true perception. So the first one, it turns out there are lots of ways in which we can induce out-of-body experiences. One of the proposals didn't get funded, unfortunately, for the for the scientific component of the Templeton Foundation grant that I received. One of the proposals was from a famous scientist who has probed the brain, a certain specific part of the brain, electronically stimulated in an effort to treat a certain kind of epilepsy. And what happened was the patients repeatedly reported out-of-body experiences, which was interesting. There are also, of course, out-of-body experiences as a result of hallucinogens. There are out-of-body experiences that are reported by pilots flying, in a small, perhaps, fighter plane who experience the G forces over a certain amount. So there are contexts in which we know that physical phenomena can induce near death. There are contexts in which physical facts about one's situation in the world can induce experiences as of being out of one's body. With regard to the apparently non-physical but true reports, contents of near-death experiences, as I mentioned before, that's perhaps the biggest challenge. What I would say is, first of all, it's an epistemological black hole because a lot of these contexts just can't be repeated. Someone reports that in a certain context, they had no way physically of having access to the information, and yet the information is true. We can't go back and replicate that and make sure that there were no physical reasons. So that's the first problem. Second, but basically I'd want to look very carefully at all the different facts just to make sure that there wasn't any way the individual got access to the information. There's a famous case where someone reported when he woke up from a near-death experience that he heard the nurse. He saw the nurses put his dentures in a certain cabinet, and turns out that's where they were, although no one could find it before he made that report. Unfortunately, there would have been ways before there would have been ways, let's say, just as he was waking up, where maybe he heard nurses say, well, we're about another patient, we're going to put your glasses over there, or any number of ways in general that people, maybe in ways that they're not even aware of, register information which they can then subsequently recall or put together, reconstruct. So I'd say the first tendency or inclination of a physicalist would be to try and figure out what alternative ways, what physical ways the individual could have come to the information. There's also a lot of what I might call, motivated reasoning. People really want their afterlife views to be confirmed. It's part of terror management. We're afraid of death. We want to manage that terror. And if we are convinced that there's some other realm where there's serenity and peace and justice, that's very important to people. So I'll give you an example. The longitudinal study I mentioned before, conducted by Sam Parnia, the doctor who's now a physician who's now, and I believe a PhD in neuroscience. He's come to the U.S. from the U.K., but he's done a long study. And what he did was he placed monitors, computer monitors, screens in the rooms of people who came in from after having cardiac events like cardiac arrest, heart attacks, and they were unconscious. They were put in rooms in the intensive care ward, and these monitors were not visible to them from their beds. And when they woke up, they flashed randomly numbers. And they were looking to see if they would report the numbers. And even when they're prompted, did you see any numbers? That was the experiment. Over time, they really haven't come up with any substantiated evidence. But the reason I mention it right now is he had to do it double blind because at first he found that the nurses were actually secretly telling the patients what the numbers were, which is really striking. But that's just an example of confirmation bias, or the tendency to be so desperate in wanting evidence that you cheat in certain ways. Now, so some of these, why do I raise this? Well, some of the reports that you're talking about might be dishonest, and we can't go back and replicate the situation. So it's fascinating. And I'll give you Sam Parnia, the fellow I just mentioned, in some of his work, which is separate from the work I just mentioned about putting the screens in people's rooms. He gives examples of many reports of the sort that we're talking about, apparently non-physical reports that turn out to be true. He has anecdotally many, many stories. There's also a serious researcher, an MD, who used to teach, now he's emeritus at the medical school at the University of Virginia. He has a book called After, in which he also discusses some of these cases. So, challenge for us, in my view, not insuperable challenge. Remember that there are examples such as premonitions. So people claim to have premonitions. I knew that thunderstorm would happen in an hour, or well, that may not be a good example because there are weather conditions before, but I was worried and I was sure that there would be a fatal accident on that freeway tomorrow. And turns out that's what happened. And there are lots of reports like this. The problem is that A, you have to screen out the ones that were insincere. B, you have to think of all the different premonitions that turn out to be false. And among the millions and millions and millions that are reported, these premonitions, almost all of them are false, and some of them are bound to be true just out of coincidence. I think the same is true with regard to the apparently non-physically accessed but true reports of near-death experiences. Some of them, once you weed out the insincere ones and the ones where people sincerely report something, but their brains registered the information in some physical way, now you're going to get some that are coincidences. That's the way I would go about it. Now, you might think, you're doing this elaborate kabuki dance to avoid just admitting what seems to be the most plausible explanation. So maybe.
Wouldn't you also like it to be the case that there is a heaven waiting good people?
Yes, I would hope that. And I'd hope I met the admissions qualifications for heaven. Yes.
Yeah.
I would love. I would like that because I don't want to go out of existence. Like you,
Yeah.
I would like to, in some way, exist forever. Yes. So, but to me, that gives even more reason to take the arguments that I make seriously, in that I'm not someone who is, you might say, antecedently hostile to religion or to views about the mind and the body, non-identity views. I'm not hostile to those at all. Matter of fact, I think you mentioned that I've done a lot of writing about philosophy of religion, mainly about the relationship between God and human freedom and moral responsibility. But I take these questions extremely seriously.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly how I see it too. I mean, I would love these near-death experiences to prove that there is something beyond this life and that it's a good thing. Because I think you have a few rare cases relative to how many cases you have of heaven. You have much fewer of hell and near-death experiences. Am I right?
Yeah, absolutely. But there are reports of hell. There's a researcher who is associated with the International Association of Near-Death Studies. I should point out that that association, informally at least, has a supernaturalistic bent in their interpretation of near-death experiences. But she has studied the bad ones, the negative ones. And she's got a book called The Buddha in Hell. And it's about supposedly a Buddhist monk who supposedly had a near-death experience that was very negative, and he saw the Buddha in hell, and so when he woke up, he converted to Christianity. But I think that experience was debunked subsequently. But there are about 20%, I believe, of the reports, 10 to 20% are of negative experiences, and it's interesting that they're very structurally and abstractly similar to the positive ones, in that you have an out-of-body experience, you're guided by a trusted individual, but now you're going from the light to the darkness. You're not ascending, but you're going down, and you basically are seeing a lot of suffering. You're not suffering yourself. So there are these negative experiences that people report. Now, it might be that they're underreported, because who wants to have people think that they are deserving of a negative uh, experience, or pointing to the fact that they might end up in hell. Uh, One thing I should also add is, I believe, although they do not provide strong evidence of an afterlife, they're significant, they're very meaningful, and we can learn from them. And I think you can learn from the negative ones as well as the positive ones. The negative ones are instructive, basically, in pointing out that if you continue to live the bad life you're living, this is what's going to happen to you. I think that the positive ones are meaningful, deeply meaningful, but not so much about an afterlife, but about living and dying.
It's frightening to hear about the many negative after or near death experiences. I didn't know that it was that many, about a fifth. I don't think one hear about that a lot. Peter, did you know that?
No, I didn't know that, and I just wanted to know, Patrick, if you now have reevaluated your wish to have a near-death experience.
Well, I'm not sure. I want experience. I want the real thing. So
Right.
I'd like to.
But the real
I
thing with the
hope.
light
Yeah,
and the
yeah,
ascendancy.
yeah. No, I wouldn't mind actually having the experience and then believing in it. But I think, as a philosopher, I only want to believe what is true, and so like Professor Fischer, we have to check our wishes. We can't really engage in motivated reasoning. Of course, I'd love for there to be heaven for all good people, but I can't really allow myself to believe that unless I'm relatively sure that it's the best way of interpreting these stances. But it's surely, I just feel it must be an incredible, horrible experience to almost die, see something that's terrible, and then come back. It must be frightening, really frightening. I mean, I discuss these matters sometimes with people who are dualists. Maybe they are not entirely substance dualists, but they allow for there to be a kind of mind that can survive without the body. And I remind them that that's not enough. In fact, it could be the worst thing possible to lose your body and just be a mind, right? And you have nothing to interact with the world with in the physical world. Like, what is that? What is that? What kind of existence? I mean, right?
Right. There's also the possibility that you'll end up in hell. And you could think of these near-death experiences, the negative ones, as bringing out graphically in a way that will have impact on you what the terrors of hell are, with the idea that you can improve. And because you're right, some people just kind of dismiss it or they joke about it. Famously, Mark Twain, American author, said he prefers heaven for the climate and hell for the company, because he worried that being in heaven would be boring, very boring, and he didn't want to listen to harp music and talk to angels. But and people, I will hear people say, "Well, I'll see you again in hell," or "I'll see you in hell." But these are serious kinds of experiences. The positive ones, like I say, I think they can teach us something about what's important in living. But also how we might make dying more humane. But they can also be illuminating and educational or instructive in other ways. So one of the people who won a sub-grant from our project is a Israeli neuroscientist and psychiatrist. Shahar Arzi is his name. And in conversation, he told me that he had a patient who reported a near-death experience, and part of it was the life review, and part of the life review depicted ways in which he treated a former romantic partner in bad ways. And he said it really brought home to him that he has to change. So that was, you could say, as it were, bad part of an overall good experience, but that the individual learned from.
To sum up your stance here, it is that it's possible that near-death experiences are veridical. They are not just experiences, but experiences of something, an afterlife. But all things considered, it looks like they probably can be explained within a normal scientific framework. Also because our normal scientific framework, especially what we know about the brain, is not yet completed. So it's premature to say the only explanation is that there really is an afterlife. You say, well, many of these experiences seem to have a natural explanations, and those that we struggle with finding an explanation, they might be explainable when we know more about the brain or so. Is that fair to say?
Yes, that's totally fair. I would just add that I think they are meaningful. And just to put it very quickly, the positive ones can point us to the possibilities of more humane ways of dying. That we don't have to die alone. We can die accompanied by or surrounded by loved ones in a serene place, a peaceful, serene place. And there are other features of the experience that suggest to us that our contemporary ways of extending life and of treating people who are dying in sterile, cold, lonely places are not good. you could think also of near-death experiences as voyages toward something greater than oneself, something other than oneself at least, again, guided by a loved one. So the importance of seeking something greater than oneself in one's life and surrounding oneself with friends and loved ones and social contents. It's part of the meaning of life, and it's also what is important for psychological health. So I just kind of scratched the surface, but people who've had these experiences report transformations that are very positive. And I think, though, we should look at them not so much as glimpses into another realm, but glimpses into the meaning of our lives and indications about more humane ways of dying.
We learn something about what's important to us. That is,
Yeah.
the visions that we see are somehow purification of something that's deep in us.
Yes.
And
Good. Yes. That's a nicer way of putting it than I put it.
your work on near-death experiences, and your work on the value of death, to relate them, I tried to in my mind. I looked at it and I thought, well, the near-death experiences work is looking at whether death is the end. And a lot of people will say that death is not bad, that's the value, because death is not the end, but it's a new beginning. Or death is not real, quite real, but it's a transition rather. So death is nothing for us to regard as bad, and therefore nothing for us to fear. And of course, that's the kind of message that a lot of people take from these experiences, and the people who read these books, they learn that we should not be afraid of death because death is not bad for us. And in fact, that's also something that people who take hallucinogenic drugs often come away with. They report saying, now I'm not afraid of death the way I was afraid of death before by taking these drugs. An interesting parallel there again. But there is another argument for why we shouldn't regard death as something bad and something to be feared, and that is that death actually is the end. So, how does that argument go? Well, they say death is the end, and therefore, when you're dead, you can no longer suffer. You're not there. Nothing bad is happening to you because you don't exist. So, death is neither good nor bad. It's nothing to us, and that's of course an old argument. So, that's something I think you disagree with, right? Because you believe, like we do, I think, that death is bad for the individual, just looking at it
Death
from
can
an
be bad,
individual's point of view.
right?
Yeah.
In many cases, death is bad for the individual, although there may be cases where someone is suffering from a terminal disease and is in a lot of pain. And in some of those cases, we might think death came as a relief. It was good that, not bad that the individual died when they did rather than later. But in most cases, it's a bad thing for the deceased individual. And it's, in my view, not because it involves suffering or torment, but because it's a deprivation of the good things of life, or deprivation of what would be on balance a better life if one died later. So it is can be a bad thing.
So when we say that it can be a bad thing, but let's say a case when somebody is suffering a great deal from, let's say, disease, and then they die, and you say, well, it was better that they died than that they continued to be in pain, right?
Right.
But wouldn't you still, though, say that it was bad that they died in the sense, but you think it was bad that they were so sick and in pain, and it's also bad that they died in the sense that you could say an amputation of a leg is good if it prevents you from dying, right? Let's say you have diabetes and you have to have an amputation to save your life. In some sense, it's too much to say that having an amputation is good. It's a terrible thing. It's just that it's even more terrible to die. So in some sense, I almost want to reject that death is not bad, even in those cases. I just think you could say rather that it's bad, it's just the least bad thing in this context. What do you say about that?
I agree that it's bad that you're in that situation in the first place. I think in a lot of cases, even though you're in painful circumstances and you're suffering, maybe you're not even mobile, you still have your mind or enough of it that you want to continue to live. And so in those cases, it definitely is a bad thing that you die now rather than later. But if you don't have anything you really care about, if you have no categorical desires, as Bernard Williams said, desires not just to have certain things if you continue to live, but desires to accomplish something or to experience something, then it can be a bad thing. I agree with you, but I don't believe it's a bad thing under certain circumstances. Um, but I don't think anything important depends on it for me. So
Mm.
I think my overall view would be consistent with accepting what you suggest, that, well, it's always bad, but maybe less bad than continuing to suffer.
It's the lesser of two evils.
Yes. Yeah.
I've been thinking about that because I'm very much of the persuasion that death is not in our interest and that it's a bad thing. And I was thinking, well, but
Yes.
is it a good thing if you're in a bad situation that's worse than death? In some sense, I think, well, that just shows us how bad death is. That is, things have to be so incredibly hopeless and terrible, right, for death to be good. I have more quarrel usually with naturalists who say death is the end, period, and it's okay. So we had Daniel Dennett, for example, who unfortunately passed away. Right, he was one of these naturalists who were kind of easygoing about death. Right,
Mhm.
he said that I've already not existed before I was born. Right, so I know non-existence. It wasn't so bad, and I'm going to go into this non-existence again, which is an old philosophical argument, right? Epicurean style argument. So if you look at the argument that, look, you're not going to non-existence is not going to be bad for you because you know that not existing, nothing can be either good or bad for you if you're a naturalist. How should we respond to that, do you think?
Well, as I said, I think there are things that can be bad as pure deprivations of what would have been good. It can be bad for us as a deprivation. And I think this is a special case of a class of bads that are non-experiential bads, like being betrayed behind one's back and never finding out about it, or having one's privacy violated. You could have your privacy violated by a secret hidden camera or someone monitoring your computer. I think there's a famous software called Pegasus that was developed in Israel uh, to fight terrorism, but is now used quite widely by governments. And sometimes I think people get a hold of this where they can somehow turn around the camera in your computer and they can see you and they can monitor what's going on. But now, if you never find out about those things, still something bad's happened to you. So I think death is one of a whole range of things. that can harm you or be bad for you without your having any negative experiences.
Yeah, I mean, and also as I'm thinking of Dennett's use of the Epicurean argument that non-existence, we already know what it is. It's what was before our birth, and that wasn't so terrible, right? I think there's a big difference here between the time before we were born and the time after we
Yes,
existed. That is, when you
right,
are alive, you have everything to lose by dying. And that's
right,
completely different from before you were born. I mean, before you were born, you didn't exist and you had nothing to lose. And now
yeah,
you have a life to lose everything to lose in some sense,
right.
right? So,
Well, to me, it's
yeah.
at least the way he puts the argument, as you reported, is problematic because it commits the mirror image version of Lucretian fallacy. The Lucretian fallacy is the fallacy of either explicitly or implicitly believing that you'll still be there in the future to suffer. So if you adopt the assumption, as Epicurus and Lucretius did, that we cease to exist, and so there's no self, there's nothing to suffer, and then you think about being in a coffin and suffering from claustrophobia or
Mm.
something like that, that's a fallacy because you're not going to be there to suffer. And it sounds like what Dennett's saying is, well, we know what prenatal non-existence is like, and it wasn't bad. Well, you weren't there at all to experience it, so
Mm.
really, it's not a good argument. But
Mm.
the other point is, I think what you said is well taken. So there are a lot of contexts where if you've never had a good, you don't really know what you're missing when you end up not having it. Like it's if you've never appreciated wine and you've never taken a wine tasting class or never developed an appreciation for fine wines, not having them is no problem. But if you do begin
Mm.
to you do learn how to make the nuanced discriminations and appreciate fine wines, it would apply to coffees or whatever, then not having them is worse. It's worse than never having that. And life might be like that.
It's also this kind of, I would call it a fallacy of looking at your life from a point completely outside your life, like Thomas Nagel would say, that you're taking a kind of a view from nowhere, as he would put it. I mean, now I am alive. Now ceasing to be alive means I'm robbed of everything I would have if I'd continued to live. This is the point that's important for me. This kind of subjective localization in time is important, but of course it's not important from like the point of view of God or the universe, but it's everything to us right now.
Yes, I agree. These things get evaluated differently from a God's eye or objective view, and for a situated view, I agree, like other things. It's interesting what you say about Dennett. I wasn't familiar with his views about death. Um, I wonder, I think he brings up something that I think is important that you might have been intending to get to, but I think that Epicurus and Lucretius and their contemporary followers, of whom there are many, are incorrect if they are intending to argue that death cannot be a bad thing or perhaps a harm, but a misfortune or bad thing for the deceased. But I do agree with them that we shouldn't fear death. And so it might be that Dennett would have been willing to say, no, I want to live longer. I want to write more about artificial intelligence. I want to prove, establish that artificial intelligence is problematic and dangerous. So I want to sail more. I want to be with my family. So he might be willing to say that death now rather than later is bad, but stick to his guns about relative indifference toward it in the sense of psychological equanimity. And that's what I think is important. And actually, if you look back at it, the Epicureans' main target was fear of death, not so much the badness of death.
Let's say a little bit more about that, because sometimes I think when I think about my own philosophy, am I telling people to be afraid of death? Because I do think that death is worth fearing. And my conclusion, I'd like to see what you think of this, is that yes, in some sense, I'm saying that death is bad, and bad can mean to be avoided. So, in the sense of fearing as recognizing that something is worth avoiding, yes, you should fear death. But the next question is, how much fear should you feel? That is, how much should you tremble in your life? And then I say, well, life is too short to tremble too much, but I think you should tremble just enough to try to take common sense measures to avoid death, and perhaps something beyond that, even support the
Yes,
science that
I
might
think
prolong our lives.
definitely agree with you. I think it can be conceptualized in that way that you shouldn't have excessive fear. I think that I would prefer to say, well, because we can, and let me emphasize this, when we're talking about the badness here, it's the badness of premature death, not the badness of the fact of death. Although I might believe that too, that the fact of death is a bad thing, but premature death can be bad. So we should take measures, to exercise and to eat wisely and not to smoke cigarettes and drink too much alcohol. All that is because we recognize that death can be death can be a tragedy. It can deprive you of all you care about. So it's rational to avoid it, to take measures to avoid it. Unfortunately, we all know people who've done everything right and they've still prematurely died, but we try our best. But that doesn't follow that we should fear it even at all. If you assume that there is no afterlife, what I do think is most of us, I don't know, Dennett probably, and Dawkins and the other, what I call in-your-face atheists, they might not fear it at all. But what I believe is there's a non-negligible chance that there is a God. And there's a non-negligible chance that God will not think that I meet the admissions criteria for heaven. It's a gated community, and maybe it's a selective context. But so I might fear it a little bit. But I don't fear it. I mean, I'd say only a little bit.
Yeah. I mean, I that's so. I compare it sometimes with, I say, how much should we fear a nuclear war? And I say we should fear it enough to try to do what little we can to
Right.
avoid it. That
Right.
is, it is fearsome. It's definitely worth fearing. It would be wrong to say that you should not fear it. But then the question becomes, how much time should you spend on fearing it? That is, and how much visceral fear how much should you tremble?
Interesting article by Jeffrey Murphy, who has passed away, American philosopher, who argued that it's rational to fear death to the extent that it will help us, give us the best chance to live a good life. And so to motivate us not to smoke tobacco, et cetera, become obese. That is rational. Now, I again think that maybe the rationality comes from a belief in the badness of premature death, but you might say fear is the most effective tool in changing behavior. And if that's right, then maybe there's a rationality. But I would want to motivate the idea that though death is or can be bad, we shouldn't fear it, because I have a general view that fear is only appropriate for a state that's painful. How does this fit with my view that perhaps it's rational to do things to avoid a premature death? Again, I think the best way to think of that is not in terms of fear, but in terms of the motivating efficacy of beliefs about badness and tragedy. But why do I think fear is irrational for situations where there's experiential blank or no suffering? I would commend to you the following thought experiment. There are two versions of it. You know that you're going to have dental surgery later this afternoon, and in the first case, you will unfortunately have to suffer for an hour because the only way they can do the surgery is, it's an important, necessary surgery, is to keep you awake, or at least, or perhaps they can't totally deaden the pain with the anesthesia for whatever reason. So you will be in significant pain for an hour. But now the other scenario is they can do it with totally putting you under total anesthesia. It's very effective. Now, should you fear the hour in the first case? Yes, I think you fear it. You deem it a bad thing, but more maybe on balance a good thing, but the pain is a bad thing, but it's also rational to fear it. I certainly would. But is it rational to fear the hour of no experience at all in the second case? No, I don't think it's rational to fear that. And again, you might worry that the surgery doesn't come about well, or you could worry that the anesthesia will cause some horrible side effect. But those are worries that, and we sometimes talk about fear that, where the fear is basically a worry or concern that a certain fact will obtain. But do you actually fear that hour of no experience? No, I don't think so. And you could think of death as permanently that way, or you can think of death on the secular view as general anesthesia forever. And my argument is, if general anesthesia for an hour is not an appropriate target or object of fear, there's no difference with regard to fearing of a certain situation. There's no difference between an hour and forever. So in summary, I do believe that premature death can be bad as a deprivation, but I don't think we should fear it. So maybe that's Daniel Dennett's view, or was his view.
Yeah, this is interesting, though. I mean, when I die in the future, then I will lose everything that depends on me being alive, all the things I value by being alive. And you say, well, you shouldn't fear that. I'm not sure.
Yeah,
I mean, what about if I say, well, I fear that all the polar bears will become extinct. So that's not going to bring me any pain, but I can fear that, right?
I would make a crucial distinction between fearing a particular state of affairs and fearing that a fact will obtain. So I can fear that I'll die prematurely. I can fear that my children will suffer after I die. I do have a real fear. I'm about to be a grandfather for the first time, and I have a fear that the world we're welcoming, quote, welcoming this child into will be one that's not very clean or beautiful. Uh, so that's a real fear, but it's a fear that, and I think it can be translated without, or paraphrased without remainder, into I worry that, I judge that, it's
Okay.
problematic that, but it's not that I'm fearing the state of affairs
Mm.
itself, or, yeah,
It's a bit ambiguous because maybe what I mean then, from your point of view, is that I believe it's reasonable to judge that death is bad for me and the extinction of the polar bears is bad for me. So I have what I call fear is what could be called a judgment.
further, that judgment can be reasonable, and certainly
Okay.
it would be bad, not just for the polar bears, but for the planet if they went out of,
Okay.
if they went out of business, as it were. Yeah.
And so then, but we agree that, and you agree with me, I guess, insofar as that fear can have some utility. It can push me to do the right thing.
Yes, that bad belief. If you call it a fear, it's okay with me, but it's a fear that definitely can have importantly good consequences. We need to take the fear that the planet is deteriorating, and take it not as something for
Mm.
despair, but as a call for action. Yeah, a call for action, and we
Yeah.
really, it's crucial right now.
Yeah. I mean, the important thing is not that we have a particular feeling, but that we do something
Yeah,
based on how we judge it to be, I
right,
guess.
right. But and
Yeah.
you might wonder why I make the distinction in the first place between fear and a judgment. One reason is fear tends to have a distorting effect on our practical reasoning. And when the fear gets significant, it's hard to keep it in its box. When you fear something, it's hard to restrict the nature and severity of it. And it's hard to control or limit its function in practical reasoning. Whereas a judgment of badness may not have those negative characteristics. So I think there's some value in thinking of death as bad, but not a subject of fear.
I was actually asked recently at the biotech conference when I spoke about my will to live for an indefinite amount of time if I was afraid of death, and my answer was that it's not really important if I'm afraid of death or not. That's not the point. The point is that I want to continue living.
I agree totally. And in some of my work, especially the debate book that Patrick kindly mentioned at the beginning, I say there are two separate reasons why you might want to live forever. One is you might think of death as a bad thing, or uh, a subject of harm. I mean, sorry, a subject of fear. You might think of death as bad or an appropriate target of fear. Therefore, you might want to eliminate death and therefore want to live forever. But another reason is just because we value certain things and we want to have other things equal more of what we value. And we recognize that living forever gives us a greater chance of getting more of what we want. And they're separate. Now, someone could have both, but you don't need to have both reasons to want immortality.
Excellent. Thank you so much. That was really helpful, and it's
Good.
quite interesting that I can see now that one can argue that one wants to live for an indefinite amount of time and probably for a very very long time, and
Yes.
yet also say I'm not telling you to be afraid of death, but I am
Right.
telling you that it's in your interest to keep living.
Right.
Usually,
And,
something like
and,
that. Okay, so
and because of
you said
that,
something else. I'm sorry.
and
Yeah.
because of that,
Um,
it could be a bad thing to prematurely die.
Mm, mm. So turning to what you said about premature, because I think a lot of philosophers and people perhaps who listen, when they hear the word premature, they have a number in mind, but you don't, right?
No. And I don't know the answer to the question of what's premature. I definitely would not have a number in mind because I know people in their 90s, excuse me, I know people in their 90s or early hundreds who still have a zest for life. They still care. I was at the bank yesterday and I was chatting with a gentleman. He said, I'm 91 years old. And he went out to his car and he drove home, or I assume he drove home. Uh, and he was communicating in a lucid way. So I wouldn't pick a number. And as we get more and more able to extend healthy life, um, I look at it, I mean, I think some of the longevity researchers and analysts of the medicine and science behind increasing longevity, what they say is we should aim primarily at increasing health span, not so much lifespan, but healthy, high quality living. And we're doing that, we're increasing it. Maybe there'll be ways of enhancing life, maybe even uploading in the future to software and to computers if that's going to be possible. So I wouldn't pick a number. And the honest truth is I don't know the answer to that question. I would say I would define, if I had to, premature as cutting off a life that's still subjectively worth living, that you still care about and value. But yeah, I have to think more about that. That's just one of the things that I have to think more about. Another thing I have to think more about is what the definition or conception of living forever that I'm working with is, because it's somewhat vague.
Mm. How about as a working definition, something like as long as you have something better to do
Very
than being
good.
dead?
That's good. That might be a good working definition. Although I worry that it might be circular, because if you ask, is death bad? What I would say is, well, what we're asking about is for a particular person, um, and what we're asking is, would premature death be bad? But if premature death is defined as death where you have something better to do, that might be circular if you're trying to answer the question of whether death can be bad. But I don't know. I mean, I think because the question can't be, is the fact that of your mortality a bad thing, i.e., we're not here. I mean, there are two separate questions. One is, would it be better if no one died at all, that we lived forever? That's an interesting question. But the question, when we're asking, can death be bad for the deceased, we're not asking, is it bad that we're not immortal? We're asking, in a particular context where someone dies, is that a bad thing for the individual? And I think that has to be somehow defined in terms of premature death. So maybe it's death of an individual who still finds their life meaningful and valuable. Or maybe it's, you could say, relative to a certain culture or nation at a particular time, it's what could be legitimately asked for or wished for. Um, think about it this way. Is it a harm to you? I don't know about is it a bad thing or a harm to you that you don't win the lottery, where you'd get $300 million? Well, I don't think it's a harm that you don't win the lottery. Is it a bad thing? I don't know. But with harm, if it's a bad thing, it's not. It's a minuscule bad thing. But it's not a harm because it's not reasonable to expect that you win the lottery or get those resources out of the blue. It's not reasonable. So harm is defined against a background of reasonable expectation set by a culture at a time. So maybe that's the way to think of premature death. It's certain expectation. Now my grandchild will have a legitimate expectation of living at least 80 years, maybe more. Let's hope more. Maybe that's how to define it. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, surely the way the word is normally used, it gets its meaning from a certain context of what's possible, what we regard as possible, for sure.
Yeah.
I guess
Yeah.
what I am trying to smuggle in a bit is, of course, my own philosophy, whereby
Yeah.
really, for anyone who has an interest in living, whenever death happens, it's a personal catastrophe. It's a very bad thing. I mean,
Yes. Yeah. I'm willing to go with that.
and
That
yeah,
when someone, the way I would say is when someone still values their life, it can be a bad thing that they die. Now, I don't know if I want to say it has to be based in objective fact. Probably not. So if someone absolutely loves counting the blades of grass in their front lawn every day, is it a bad thing that they die prematurely? From an objective standpoint, not so much, but from a subjective, it could be a tragedy. So I don't know how to reconcile those two points of view.
one of the things people say when they agree that, you know, death, okay, it can be bad for you, right, is that they say, well, yeah, but it's actually better than continuing to live too long. And too long, in their conservative estimate, is, you know, beyond 100 or 120 or something very realistic, so to speak. But so one of the things they say is that if we don't have this limit that we happen to have, or something close to it, it would kind of make life meaningless. And I know that's something you've been thinking a lot about, those kind of arguments, that, you know, if we give up death, we give up meaning. I'd love to hear you talk about that a bit.
Yeah, it's funny because you hear arguments both ways. Some people say without death there would be no meaning. Other people say there's no meaning because we're going to die. And you see that in some of the existentialists. Uh, I believe that a meaningful life, it's hard to define, of course, but relative to our shared conception, there are certain features that are meaningfulness enhancing, and there are other features that are meaningfulness diminishing. Some of the enhancing factors are, as I mentioned, being socially connected with loved ones and family and colleagues and teammates. Maybe being in touch with something larger than oneself, where that doesn't necessarily mean a God or a heavenly figure, but with science or philosophy or poetry or music, you're contributing or you're appreciative. There are many ways in which we get out of ourselves and our loneliness, both our psychic loneliness and our loneliness in the space of value, you could say, the metaphysical space. Those are meaningfulness enhancing features. Accomplishments, leaving a mark, in other words, influencing. Those aren't the only ones, but there are meaningfulness enhancing. And my belief is that you don't need death for any of that. You don't need to believe that you are mortal to pursue a life with the paradigmatic meaningfulness enhancing characteristics. So, in way too brief and oversimplified form, that's my view.
So as an example, you would say to engage in philosophy and be very interested in finding out the true nature of various things is meaningful. And you also believe it's meaningful and it doesn't really need any outside license to be meaningful, so to speak. It doesn't need God, it doesn't need nature, it doesn't even perhaps need other people, but finding an interest in finding out the true nature of things can be just one part of meaning that really doesn't need death. But have you ever felt that death undermines that particular meaning, or is it independent?
I think it's independent. I think Susan Wolf puts it well, although I'm not sure I agree with all of it. That meaning takes place at the intersection of subjective and objective value. So you need subjective engagement in a project, but it has to have objective value. So someone might love counting the light bulbs in the baseball or soccer stadium, or someone might love counting the blades of grass in the front yard, or transcribing the War and Peace or whatever over and over again, or playing tic-tac-toe. That's subjective value, but doesn't have much objective value. So the meaningfulness enhancing property of those activities is minimal. But you could also engage in science or philosophy but not care at all about it. You're just doing it for some reason. That might not have the subjective component. So you have to find things at the intersection. But I don't think passion for something or its being objectively valuable depends on there being an end or a belief in an end. I just don't see it. I suppose, I mean, people have worried about whether you would procrastinate, you wouldn't be motivated to pursue your projects because you think, well, I'll always have more chances. There's no rush. Maybe you wouldn't get off the couch at all. Or maybe preciousness comes from finitude, that we value things more when the object or the desired thing is scarce. Scarcity, let's say in economics, if a product is scarce, other things equal, keeping the demand the same, it's going to be worth more. The price will go up. Maybe time is like that. But I reject all of these arguments. I think we enjoy and find purpose in things when we immerse ourselves fully in them, almost like what's sometimes called flow experience, or a meditative experience where nothing else matters except the experience itself and your engagement in it. Those things can give meaning to life. But there are other things. So why should I get off the couch if I'm thinking about now I'm happily married, so this is a hypothetical, but there's some interesting person, a woman who I might want to invite out and maybe develop a relationship. If I say, oh, I'll have an infinite amount of time or an indefinite, I'm not going to do it, I might lose the opportunity. She may find someone else. There's an American saying, you snooze, you lose. And, if you procrastinate, you can lose opportunities, relationships, business opportunities. You probably know in science, my sister-in-law is a well-known astrophysicist, and she tells me about the competition to be the first to write a paper announcing that they've discovered another planet, an exoplanet. And in philosophy, you can sometimes be scooped if you wait long enough. Someone else can publish. So there are lots of reasons to be motivated. We don't need to fear death. We can fear depression and disappointment and loneliness. So in my work, we can't possibly do it right now because unfortunately we have finite amount of time. But in my work, I try and systematically go through all the arguments of as you use the term apologist, which comes from an interesting book by Grumman, Grumann, in the 1960s, in which he distinguished apologists from prolongifists. And I use the term curmudgeons for the apologists, and I know it's a somewhat tendentious term, but I use it anyway. And I go through all the curmudgeons arguments pretty systematically, and I try to offer countervailing considerations. And in the end, I think that there's a good argument that for optimism about immortality in the sense, not in the sense of the environment and sustainability, but in the sense that there's nothing in human nature itself that rules out the choice-worthiness of living forever. That's my view. There's nothing in the very nature of human personality or character and our relationships to other individuals that would entail that we shouldn't choose to live forever. I feel pretty strongly about that.
I just had an observation here that you mentioned that being in the present, getting to that flow state is part of those times when you feel a lot of meaning in what you do. And the interesting thing about actually being present is that there is no past and there is no future. So you can't really think about how death is giving you meaning. You're just in the present, right? I sometimes feel like this is some pervasive myth that nobody really does anything because they're going to die one day. It's not like I, do this podcast episode because I have to do it now, right? I do it because I enjoy it, because it's stimulating. Yeah, just it was no question really, just an observation that when you're in the present, you can't really think about death.
Right. And it's a deep point about meaningfulness in life, because some people define it in terms, following Williams and others, as exhaustively specified by projects, the projects I have, and that's what gives meaning. But meditative, spiritual experiences, flow experiences really aren't captured by projects. They're not moving towards some goal, but they're intrinsically in themselves valuable. And so I think that's an important point. And though, of course, we can't live always like that, but we can have a life in which flow experiences, meditative, spiritual experiences are integrated with projects and sensual experiences. And I think that mix can give life meaning. Yeah. Now, and let me also agree with you. Think about a delicious meal. If you like a cheeseburger. If you like a tofu vegetable scramble, stir fry, a tofu stir fry, and it's delicious, and you eat it and you enjoy it. It's not that you're thinking, I better enjoy this now because at some point I'm going to be dead. Yeah, you're enjoying it in the moment. And I think that's important.
I always think it's very bizarre when people say they don't want to live beyond a certain age because they can't now picture what kind of projects they would do then. I mean,
Right.
life evolves and we take on new projects, right?
Yes. Yes.
It's almost like there's a fear of the openness
Right.
of imagining a more open-ended life, that it has to be like full of these specific projects and so on, which just seems to be kind of a prejudice of the time, that these things are important. When you were talking about, well, look, we can just be in the now, for example, things that do not have this structure in a certain way, right?
Absolutely.
That's one thing. I just want to say another thing. You were pointing to like positive experiences and projects that drive us forward, but you can also make the case for all the negative things that drives us and gets us out of procrastination. Like It's not
Yes.
it's not having a terrible toothache and then somebody tells you, don't worry, you're going to live forever. It has nothing to do
Right.
with the thing. I still
Right.
don't want to have my toothache. I mean, it's not relevant.
Depression,
And that's
pain.
just one pain. There's a pain of ostracization, it's a pain of etc. etc. If you don't fulfill your obligations, people will hate you, and so on, so on.
Right.
That you live for a long time doesn't make that better. It almost makes it worse.
Yes. Yes. Loneliness, depression, pain, they all have a certain logic that goes against procrastination. I mean, if I've fallen, I'm on the soccer pitch and I fall. No, I don't play. I'm too old to play soccer. But if I fall and I have a horrible sprained ankle and I'm in terrible pain, and the emergency people come and they say, "Don't worry. I see that you have a tag on that says you're going to live forever. Don't worry. Eventually it'll go away." It's just totally not going to resonate with me. I'm going to say, "I hurt now, so give me that shot now." And if you're depressed, it's one of the worst feelings in the world. And you don't want to be told, "Don't worry, you'll live forever. Eventually you'll get over it." You want to take measures, perhaps medication and talk therapy. But yeah, there are lots of reasons why we want to get off our sofa and do things. And it's not just because we're afraid of death. We want more good things and we want to avoid certain bad things.
It's similar to those arguments that say we are going to become bad people and do bad things if we
Yeah,
can die, which is also really absurd. Like, why would I, for example, want to hurt people I love just because I'm going to live a long time? It doesn't make sense.
yes,
You
that's
know,
right. I would have
I mean,
a
even
lot
from a narrow self-interested point of view, why would I want people not to collaborate with me and hate me? I mean, just because they live for a long time. I mean,
yeah, I
sorry.
think that's really, I think a priori, it's just as reasonable to assume that eventually we'll become good forever. I mean, and uh, it would seem that would be an argument for not having children at all. You could say there's a good chance that the child will turn out to be, like in the movie The Bad Seed, an evil person. So you shouldn't have children at all. I mean, I don't think the arguments are good. I should just say, with all due respect, Bernard Williams was a very influential philosopher, and I engage obviously with his arguments, and he's made some important contributions. I respect him, but when I first read his famous argument about Alina Macropolis, the Macropolis case, um, and I I felt this is obviously wrong. Well, he argued that every human being necessarily should choose not to be immortal, should not choose to live forever. And I thought that might be true of some people in some circumstances, but not generally. Then I carefully looked at his arguments. I didn't find any of them good. And that's one reason I started writing about it. I just don't find the arguments generally very persuasive. Caveat, there are some reasons why I really think that I'm not as confident in my view. I mean, I'm not certain of it, or I believe reasonable people can disagree. One is the questions about overpopulation and environmental destruction. Another one is whether so much would have to change about human life that it's not recognizable. So people presumably couldn't have children, or their children couldn't have children. At some point, we have to stop having children and families. And how are you going to enforce that? How are we going to conceptualize life without that element? Contracts would have to be changed, marriage contracts, but all sorts of contracts would have to change. Society would have to change a lot in ways that make it not quite so clear that we can conceptualize it. But the environmental concerns are real. The way I put it, and this is disappointing to some, even to me, I am focused on philosophical concerns that come out of Bernard Williams' work about whether human nature is incompatible with immortality. Now, I don't think there are deep facts about human beings and our relationships to others that imply that we wouldn't choose or shouldn't choose to live forever. Though I just pointed to some worries. I don't think it's clear, but I do think there's a good case. But that is not to say that I'm optimistic about human ability to solve the climate crisis. And I'm certainly not optimistic that we could, from an environmental perspective, sustain radical life transformation to where we're living forever. I'm kind of I'm not a pessimist about that, but I'm a realist. So I'm optimistic with regard to the curmudgeon's arguments. I think that human nature in itself does not entail the undesirability of immortality. But I'm realistic in the sense that I think that it's not at all clear that human beings will curb our tendency to exploit the environment in such a way as to sustain immortality.
Yeah, I know you probably have conversations with John K. Davies
Oh, yes.
on this issue, right?
Yes.
We
John
also had
Davis.
a show on these issues.
Yes.
Uh,
Now
so,
they come to
yeah.
the fore in my debate book with Stephen Cave, Should You Live to
Mm.
Choose to Live Forever? He's an excellent British philosopher who argues based on environmental concerns that we shouldn't. And John Davis, actually, a California State University colleague of mine, and he was one of the people who got a subgrant from the Immortality Project. Right. So, I have, the way I would put it is, you might distinguish curmudgeons with respect to the environment and curmudgeons with respect to human nature. And I agree that the environmental problems are deeply, deeply disturbing. I do not agree that the philosophical questions are as disturbing.
Could I ask you how we should reconcile this with? I mean, if the argument is that it could be a disaster for the environment, which could be debatable. I mean, it might not have to do with how many people we are, but how the resources are exploited, right? So, but if the argument is that there could be a disaster, with overpopulation and further straining on the environment. How should we think about vaccines or penicillin or anything that modern medicine has given us to survive and thrive for longer? And how should we think about um, a cure for cancer or a cure for dementia or a cure for heart disease? All of those things that are caused by aging, and which I don't think there's any debate in, like in the cancer community, about overpopulation. So it's just interesting to me that whenever we talk about longevity in an aging context, these arguments do seem to pop up more than they otherwise do.
The way I look at it is similar to the way some of the longevity theorists think of it. And one that pops to mind, though he's not as rigorous scientifically and not as well regarded as some, although he's an interesting person, is Aubrey de Grey, who has argued the following, that we should put a lot of resources into solving or addressing the 7 main causes of premature death in human beings, cancer, heart disease, Alzheimer's, all the different causes of death. And as we go, we'll perhaps solve one before the others. and that will give us more time, and we'll keep going, and we'll solve the next one, and that will give us more time until we've solved all 7 of them. And at that point, we will have reached a kind of longevity escape velocity, as he says. It's kind of like what Ray Kurzweil calls, what does he call it? He thinks Ray Kurzweil is a longevity proponent who talks about the possibility. He takes supplements, he takes prescription medicine, and he hopes to get to the point where he will be uploaded to software and live forever. He calls that the singularity. Aubrey de Grey calls it longevity escape velocity. But we prolong life to the point where ultimately we'll be clever enough to eliminate death entirely. That's the way I would think of it. I also think, though, they're important. We have to decide how to distribute our resources. And though I believe we ought to spend much more on cancer research and research on addressing all these other diseases, and as we go, they'll help certain people to live longer, and eventually maybe the species to live much longer. Of course, we have to give considerable resources to mitigating environmental disaster and preventing tyrants from taking over. So we can't pour everything into it. But I totally agree with you that if we are able to solve these other health problems and achieve either living forever or living much longer, we would have to also address how we are polluting the environment and how we're going to limit population. Those are problems that also have to be addressed. But you can't just say, there would be overpopulation, therefore we don't want to try to cure cancer.
You need to tell the listener what you mean by immortality, because
Okay.
it's not quite such a simple concept.
Absolutely. The concept of immortality, it's not simple. And I think the best way forward when we're discussing it, and certainly writing about it, is just to distinguish the different kinds of immortality and be specific about which one we're talking about in our context. Stephen Cave, in another book called Immortality, which he wrote solo, distinguishes various forms of immortality, which I think is very helpful. I mean, one is in an afterlife, living forever in an afterlife world. And one version of that would be secular, where you believe in, let's say, reincarnation, where in some sense you still exist, but with a very different body. Another would be uploading to software, to computers, where you exist. You may not be living forever, but you exist forever. Another would be the religious conception, of course, of an afterlife, where you exist in a heaven or a purgatory or a hell or some other realm. That's a kind of eternality or immortality. And for the curmudgeons, at least they have to take note of the fact that billions of people throughout the world are religious and cling to the view that it would be desirable to live, or could be desirable to exist forever. And in the Christian and some Christian views, it's eternal life. So a lot of people believe in that. Now, if you just think about embodied human life, embodied roughly the way we are, and not thinking about replacing the whole body for now, there's still different conceptions. One is you live in an infinite number of years. You live forever, and you know that. Forever in a very strong sense. But another kind of immortality, the one that I like to focus on because I think it's the most easily grasped and reasonable to aspire to, is what Stephen Cave calls medical immortality, but what we in our debate book call radical life extension, radical life extension. This would be the idea that we don't die of natural causes. We don't die of heart attacks or strokes, but we can die by being shot in the head or falling off a cliff or being run over by a semi-truck, whatever it is. So we're medically immortal. We have radical life extension. That, on average, how long would it be? There's a social scientist who guessed 6,000 years. I don't know. We could say radical life extension is one view of immortality, of living forever. And it's on balance or on average 6,000 years. It could be one year, it could be one day, or it could be 10,000 years or 20,000, but on average it's 6,000.
I think one way to think about that is that your risk of dying doesn't increase with the passage of time, right? So your risk of dying when you're in your 20s is something like 1 in 1,000 or similar. And so if your risk of dying would be constant from your age 20, 25, right? Then you could make an educated guess about how long you would live.
That's excellent. I like that. I hadn't thought of that as a definition because when you really push it, it's not clear. Like so you wouldn't die of a heart attack, or of diabetes, but does that mean you could live any way you want and not have physical consequences? And in fact, in a lot of contexts, let's say you do die of heart failure, even if it's not the primary cause. It's all I'm saying. It's kind of hard to define, but I like your suggestion of your chances, the probabilities of your dying this year or today doesn't change if you're medically immortal or if you have radical life extension. And to suppose otherwise, suppose someone said, when I'm 9,000 years old, my chance of dying will be much greater today. That would be to commit the Monte Carlo fallacy, basically, to say that because the coin has come up heads the last 10 times, it's very likely that it will come up tails. No, that's the Monte Carlo fallacy. So I do that's an excellent suggestion.
So in fact, you would be perhaps against absolute immortality where you cannot die. But you're before what you call medical or what we could call contingent or biological immortality.
I think that's a good clarification. And the reason I think that's true is I would like an escape hatch, or I'd like an exit strategy. Sartre famously wrote a play called No Exit, and it's a kind of dystopian conception. And if I were truly immortal, that's the term that sometimes is used to distinguish it from medical immortality, then I could not be killed by anyone. And how could it be the case that no one else could kill me, but I could kill myself? So it's a situation in which I could not bring about my own death, and that's scary to me. But if I have medical immortality, I could. And I want that exit strategy.
I agree. Let me just say also, it's quite frustrating that a lot of the arguments against radical life extension really presupposes a kind of absolute conception of immortality whereby we cannot die. So philosophers sometimes say, well, look how horrible it would be to be unable to die. Therefore, we shouldn't extend our lives. And
Right.
It's a complete fallacy.
That's a good point. I try and make that, though maybe not as clearly as I should early on in my writings, but I believe that some of the literature that comes out of Bernard Williams' famous article fails to distinguish true immortality from medical immortality, and therefore the arguments are vitiated. arguments against true immortality are not always or necessarily arguments against radical life extension. So I agree with your point thoroughly. And let's, when you think of some of the arguments going back to motivation and procrastination, if I am only medically immortal, I don't know whether I'll be killed today. And that gives me motivation to go out and do what needs to be done. So some of the arguments really don't work. Another famous argument against the coherence of an immortal human life is human lives are or correspond to narratives, and a narrative has to have an ending. And they say an immortal life doesn't have an ending, so it can't be a narrative. But of course, a medically immortal life does have an ending. So I think that's another example of the dialectic infelicities that permeate some of the literature on immortality.
Plus, it's like they never heard of EastEnders, because that's a soap opera that doesn't seem to end, or
Yeah,
Mahler's Unfinished Symphony. Some pieces of art
that's right.
don't have an ending.
Right. They don't necessarily, soap operas, you're right, can go on forever. They don't necessarily have to end. And what can happen is they follow certain characters, and the characters develop and change, and there might be an organic change to new characters, but it all follows a kind of narrative arc. And so even if you define a narrative, strictly speaking, as having an ending, there are other features of narratives that still could be present in an immortal life. So one of my mantras is the story that you tell of a putatively immortal life doesn't have to be exactly like a narrative. It can be sufficiently similar to recognize it as a human life. Yeah.
So we want to be respectful of your time. It's been a wonderful wonderful interview and a conversation. There's a question that we would like to ask, because we're going to have some of the important scientists behind this project, and that is the avenue of extending human life by replacement. And it starts with replacing the heart and the lungs and the vital organs. But at its very end, the idea is that we grow clones, bodies, and then we place our brains in these clones. And we grow clones, of course, without the capacity of conscious existence, right? But just as a vehicle to put our brain in when our real bodies have become too frail. Now, are there any that you can see, any ethical worries here?
Okay, first, we'd have to maybe specify the situation more. You're not imagining that we take organs from other people. You're imagining that we can just grow everything, perhaps artificially, or using human tissues as the basis, and then we transfer the brain. And you could even imagine not transferring the brain, but the mental information. The simple answer is I don't really know. I guess that if I were to think about it more carefully, I might find some ethical worries. But one of the things I believe, though in my work, I explore hypothetical uh, examples or counterfactual cases, sometimes called science fiction cases. But I also am respectful of the fact that once you abstract away from our reality a lot, our intuitions, moral intuitions, should be suspect or increasingly suspect. And one way of putting it is our moral principles are, to put it metaphorically, built for the world roughly as it is. And we don't necessarily know what to say about worlds that are sufficiently dissimilar to ours. So maybe that's a cop-out, but that's something I feel. The only ethical considerations I could think of would be, right, if you're harvesting organs from others, if the cloned body could somehow get out, escape, and behave, but that we're assuming it doesn't have executive function, it doesn't have a central processing unit. I think there would be an ethical problem if somehow you could clone lots of different bodies, and you could grow lots of different bodies and transfer the mental contents then to an indefinitely large number of brains. Then that would be obviously ethically problematic and metaphysically puzzling. Uh, but other than that, you know, I don't see any ethical problems.
I just came up with perhaps one, and that is it would cause negative feelings in bioconservatives. They would feel repugnance.
That might not be a negative thing. Well, because as you know, abortion in even early pregnancy causes such repugnance. But yeah, I mean, like I said, our moral principles often run out when we think about counterfactuals, though I'm the last person to say we shouldn't think about any. My good friend John Perry, who's written a lot on personal identity and has thought about all the different possibilities about cloning and fusion and fission, and you know, he says in the end there are some cases about which it's difficult to say anything because our moral principles, if you say, these are our principles, now let's extrapolate, it still doesn't solve the problem because they're just not, I don't know, they run out. Now, maybe that's incredibly conservative, and maybe the answer should be, let's think more carefully, or let's find the core truths in our moral principles. Now they should be extrapolated. But it's that kind of, on the one hand, there's a Wittgensteinian tendency to say, what matters is our practices. We don't know what to say about these cases because they fall out of our practice. And there's the other non-Wittgensteinian approach. And I tend to take the latter, but I'm very cautious about counterfactual. Let me give you another quick example. Sorry to spend this much time. But if you think of Judith Jarvis Thompson's famous example pertaining to abortion, in which she imagines that you are non-consensually hooked up to a famous violinist, and the only way the violinist can live is by using your kidneys for 9 months. And she says it would be perfectly okay for you to detach. So therefore, she concludes that abortion is permissible in certain cases. And it's a very interesting case. But once you think about it carefully, complexities arise that might make you rethink your initial intuition. And I think that happens often when we abstract away from our reality in presenting a case. When you fill it in, you might have a different view.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Thank you
Peter,
for this.
Professor Fischer, do you have any other things you want to say, or is this a good
No, I just
place
want to thank you
to?
for the conversation. And in fact, I don't always learn something useful from a podcast, but I definitely learned something very helpful, and I also enjoyed it. So thank you.